2 minutes ago, a quiet decision inside the palace cracked open a power story the public was never meant to follow. King Charles has reportedly adjusted inheritance plans after recent family discussions, but the real shock is what that phrase usually hides. Because in royal life, inheritance isn't just money, it's access, protection, leverage, and loyalty rewards. And if Charles is changing plans now, it means someone pushed hard, someone threatened consequences, and someone else is about to lose everything. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Because when a monarch adjusts inheritance plans, it is never a simple administrative tweak. It is a signal. A message delivered in silence, felt in hallways, understood in glances. In this world, inheritance is the hidden language of power, the difference between being protected and being exposed, between being welcomed and being tolerated, between being family and being a liability kept at a careful distance. And the moment word spreads that Charles has changed something even slightly, the entire internal ecosystem starts to shift, like a chessboard hit from underneath. What the public hears as inheritance is often a neat headline about wealth. What insiders understand is something sharper: titles and residences that carry status, trust structures that fund independence, access that opens doors, security that decides who gets to feel safe and who is left vulnerable. It is not just money. It is permission. It is leverage. It is the quiet reward for loyalty and the quiet punishment for becoming inconvenient. So when Charles moves even one piece, he does not merely alter a future payout. He reshapes a hierarchy that people have been relying on for years. And those recent family discussions? That phrase is almost always code. It suggests conflict that could not be spoken about publicly. It suggests pressure, bargaining, and the kind of strategic negotiation where affection and duty become currency. The discussions weren't tea and sympathy. They were likely the sort of conversations that tighten the air in a room, where everyone speaks softly because the truth is too explosive to say plainly. Someone wanted something. Someone refused something. And Charles, caught between the weight of tradition and the need for control, made a decision that doesn't feel like generosity, it feels like containment. That's why secrecy kicks in immediately. Only a small circle is allowed to know, and the moment they know, the machine goes into motion. Staff slip into containment mode, not with drama, but with discipline. Information gets sliced into fragments and handed out only to those who need to know. Schedules become more controlled. Conversations get shorter. The palace doesn't panic outwardly, it tightens inwardly. Because in an inheritance story, the most dangerous thing is not the change, it's who discovers it, and when. And already there is the first hint of who is affected. Not a name, not officially, but a chilling phrase. An unnamed family branch is being repositioned. That word sounds harmless until you understand what it really means. Repositioned often means downgraded. It means moved away from the center. It means reduced access, reduced influence, reduced protection. It means someone's future is being rewritten quietly, and they are expected to accept it without protest. But in a family where status has always been oxygen, the removal of status feels like suffocation. That's where the emotional undertone becomes impossible to ignore. Charles isn't just making a strategic move, he's wrestling with something personal. The pull of affection, the weight of duty, the fear of scandal, the dread of looking weak, the pressure to look decisive. Because every king learns the same brutal lesson: love does not protect the crown. Sometimes love threatens it, and when that happens, a monarch has to decide what matters more, his relationships or the institution that devours hesitation. Then comes the detail that makes this story feel like the beginning of a larger war. A single clause change triggers a chain reaction across the family. One adjustment can set off a cascade. Who gets what? Who loses what? who is quietly pushed aside, who becomes newly empowered. In royal life, power rarely moves in big, obvious explosions. It shifts through paperwork, through silent decisions, through arrangements that look normal until you realize they are designed to control behavior. And once one clause changes, everyone starts asking the same question in private. Is this just the first cut? Because the real cliffhanger isn't what Charles changed. It's who finds out before it's meant to leak. Someone always does. A trusted aide overhears something. A detail slips. A conversation is repeated in a slightly different room. And the moment the wrong person realizes they've been repositioned, the palace doesn't just face disappointment, it faces retaliation. Because people who believe they are entitled to the old system rarely accept the new one quietly. But to understand why Charles would risk detonating the family balance, you have to look at what happened in those recent discussions and what was demanded behind closed doors. The palace calls them family discussions. Insiders call them pressure sessions, where love is weighed against optics and loyalty is measured in silence. Charles didn't wake up planning to rewrite inheritances. He was cornered by competing agendas, old resentments, and a new fear that the wrong person might gain leverage at the worst possible moment. One conversation escalated, one demand crossed a line, and suddenly inheritance became the weapon everyone reached for. It starts with the kind of invitation that sounds harmless on paper, but feels heavy in the gut. A meeting, a private gathering, a catch-up, and yet everyone arrives knowing it is not a catch-up at all. It is a tribunal wrapped in family language. The air is polite, the smiles are controlled, but the room holds a tension that only exists when people have already decided what they want and are now negotiating how painful the process will be. Charles sits at the center of it all, not as a father figure, not as a kindly relative, but as the final authority everyone is trying to sway without appearing to pressure him. Because the factions are already formed. Some push for one outcome with cold precision, protect the crown at any cost, even if it means cutting someone loose. Others push for another with emotional desperation. Protect the individual, keep the peace, avoid humiliation, avoid creating an enemy inside the family. It isn't simply right versus wrong. It's risk versus reputation. Short-term calm versus long-term stability. And Charles, in the middle, feels the strain of both sides pulling at his conscience like rope. He looks tired in the way only a monarch can look tired, emotionally exhausted, yet still calculating, still aware that every choice becomes precedent. The conversation circles the truth without naming it. It uses royal euphemisms, arrangements, support, structure, what's best. But what's really being discussed is leverage. Who deserves it? Who has abused it? Who might weaponize it if they feel cornered? Because everyone in that room understands the danger of a volatile relative with resources, status, and a grievance. That combination can become a fire that burns for years. Then the demand comes. Not shouted, not even stated directly, but it lands with force. A key player makes it clear, meet my terms, or I withdraw cooperation. Meet my terms, or I speak to the wrong people. Meet my terms, or I stop playing along with the narrative that protects you. It's the kind of threat that never needs to mention the press by name to feel like a gun on the table. And that's when Charles's posture changes, not outwardly, because he has spent a lifetime trained not to show reaction, but inwardly, because he recognizes the shape of blackmail even when it's dressed in family grievances. The discussion reveals the fractures that have been widening for years. Jealousy disguised as principle, entitlement disguised as tradition, old punishments remembered like scars, fear disguised as concern. People talk about fairness, but what they mean is advantage. People talk about duty, but what they want is protection from consequences. And the most disturbing part is how quickly love becomes transactional. Inheritance in this context isn't about compassion, it's about leverage that can be granted or revoked depending on how safely someone behaves. That's when someone proposes a compromise, and for a moment it sounds reasonable, balanced, diplomatic. The kind of solution a palace would love because it can be marketed as unity. But Charles hears the trap inside it. The compromise isn't designed to protect anyone's dignity. It's designed to contain a problem while keeping the institution clean. It offers a soft landing that looks generous, but removes real power-reduced access, restructured support, conditions quietly attached. A deal that says, you can keep comfort as long as you surrender control. And if you refuse, you'll be painted as greedy, unstable, or disloyal. The room tightens, not with shouting, but with calculation. Because now inheritance has moved from family future to discipline tool. And once that happens, the conversation stops being about what is right and becomes about what can be enforced. Charles understands that if he gives in, he sets a precedent, threats work. If he refuses, he risks retaliation that could spill into headlines and destabilize the very image he is sworn to protect. Either way, he loses something: peace, trust, or control. Then comes the foreshadowing that makes the entire exchange feel dangerous. A private note exists, or a recording, or a message that was never meant to be preserved. The kind of thing that can be used like a blade, because it proves who said what, who promised what, who sounded uncertain, who sounded cruel. The moment Charles senses that a private artifact might be floating somewhere outside his control, the stakes multiply. Because paper and recordings don't forget. They don't forgive. They don't soften with time. They wait for the right moment to destroy. And once leverage entered the room, it stopped being a family conversation and became a battle over who controls the future. The public imagines royal inheritance as jewels and estates. But the real inheritance is something far more dangerous: influence. A home that comes with status. A trust that buys independence. A title that opens doors. A private allowance that keeps someone quiet. The palace has always used inheritance like a chessboard, moving pieces, rewarding loyalty and punishing risk. And when Charles adjusts plans, it's not paperwork, it's a message. Because in the royal world, money is never just money. It's a lever. Residences determine proximity to power. Allowances determine freedom or dependence. Security isn't only protection, it's a signal of importance. Staffing isn't only support, it's access, influence, and the ability to move through spaces most people will never see. Inheritance becomes a system of invisible doors. Some open with ease, others lock without explanation. And the people inside the family know it. They might pretend it's tradition, but they feel it as control. That's why conditional generosity becomes the most effective tool the palace has. Not cruelty, not public punishment, just quiet funding tied to behavior, quiet privileges tied to obedience. If you cooperate, you're comfortable. If you create risk, your comfort becomes negotiable. It's the kind of control that looks benevolent from the outside, but feels suffocating from within because it teaches one brutal lesson: your stability depends on staying manageable. And the moment you stop being manageable, the system starts rewriting your future. The timing makes it worse. Insiders whisper there's an upcoming event, a moment where the family will be watched more closely than usual, where unity has to look real, where stability has to be convincing. In that context, inheritance planning isn't just long-term housekeeping, it's urgent damage control. Because if there's even a chance that a volatile relative could create headlines at the wrong moment, Charles doesn't just want to reduce the risk. He wants to remove the leverage. He wants the chessboard arranged so the pieces that threaten him can't move freely. And there's precedent for that. The doctor calls it quiet settlement, the way past monarchs used inheritance to end arguments without ever admitting an argument existed. A conflict gets smoothed over with a residence, a trust, a carefully structured allowance. A potential scandal gets diffused with support that looks kind in public and feels like containment in private. That's how the institution survives. It doesn't always fight battles openly. It pays to end them until it decides the payment itself has become too risky. Because the most dangerous part of any adjustment isn't the numbers, it's the clauses, the conditions, the lines of text that can wake up old promises the family hoped were buried forever. The doctor hints that one clause, just one, could expose a long-buried family understanding about who would be protected, who would be maintained, who would never be allowed to fall. And if Charles is changing that now, it suggests he's willing to break something sacred inside the family in order to protect something larger. But the shift also threatens something the palace fears almost as much as scandal: a rival power center. Because when you take from one branch, you usually give to another. When you cut one person out, you often cut in someone else. And that isn't just redistribution, it's a declaration of loyalty. A new favorite, a new priority, a new hierarchy. And once the hierarchy changes, the family doesn't just feel it financially, they feel it emotionally. Like a wound. When inheritance changes inside the royal family, someone always finds out late, and someone always finds out in the most humiliating way possible. The doctor-like secrecy is brutal. No warning, no honest conversation, just a sudden shift in what you're entitled to. And according to insiders, this adjustment targets a specific branch of the family, one that has caused headaches, headlines, and private rage. Whoever it is, they're about to feel what royal punishment really looks like. It starts subtly, the way royal punishments always start. A phone call that doesn't come, a meeting that gets rescheduled and never rebooked, a familiar warmth that suddenly feels distant. The affected family member senses it before anyone confirms it, because in that world, silence is never neutral. Silence is information. And the psychological blow hits hard, because their identity has been tied to privilege for so long that losing privilege feels like losing self. It isn't just, I'm losing support, it's, I'm being erased. Allies split immediately. Some quietly support the change because they believe it will protect the institution. Others fear backlash because they've seen what desperation can do to someone who feels cornered. And then a new figure emerges in the shadows of the story, a replacement beneficiary, someone being positioned closer to the center. That's when jealousy turns into panic, because replacement isn't just financial, it's symbolic. It's the palace saying, without saying it, you are no longer essential. And the moment that realization lands, the real danger begins. Because the cut-out person doesn't just feel betrayed, they feel threatened. They start searching their own pockets for leverage, for proof, for a bargaining chip that forces the palace to negotiate. The doctor hints they have something, a detail, a document, a conversation that was never meant to leave the room, something that could embarrass the crown, something that could ignite headlines, something that could turn this quiet adjustment into a public war. That's the cliffhanger hovering over every corridor now. If the change proceeds, the person being cut out might go nuclear. They might expose something out of spite, out of desperation, out of the raw terror of being reduced to nothing. And that is why Charles's inheritance adjustment is not simply a plan, it's a fuse. But the most explosive part isn't the money, it's who gets cut in and who gets quietly cut out. Because the moment someone is cut out, the palace doesn't just face anger, it faces retaliation. Here's what the palace fears more than financial disputes: public chaos. If the wrong person feels cornered, inheritance isn't the end of the story, it's the trigger. Insiders hint that the adjustment came with a warning attached: cooperate, or the family's private business becomes everyone's entertainment. And once that threat is made, Charles's decision stops being about fairness. It becomes about preventing a catastrophe that could stain the crown for years. The first sign of danger is always the same: someone inside identifies a potential leak, and suddenly the palace doesn't feel like a home. It feels like a lockdown. Phones go quiet. Conversations become shorter. People who normally drift in and out of rooms with ease now look like they're walking through invisible checkpoints. Staff scramble to lock down information, not because they enjoy secrecy, but because they understand what a leak can do. One detail becomes a headline, one headline becomes a narrative, and a narrative, once loose, cannot be put back in a file. A secret meeting is called to assess risk exposure, the kind of phrase that sounds clinical until you realize it's about human beings and reputations. Who knows what? Who told whom? What evidence exists? What messages were sent? What documents were copied? The palace doesn't just fear embarrassment, it fears losing control of the storyline at a time when control is everything. The inheritance adjustment becomes less about what is right and more about what is safe, and that shift is where the moral rot begins. Charles feels the pressure tightening from all sides. He is urged to act fast, not because speed equals justice, but because speed can remove leverage from a volatile relative before that relative decides to burn the house down. The logic is brutal. If you cut off the resources, you cut off the threat. If you restructure support, you restructure behavior. But Charles isn't only managing a crisis, he is managing a family. And families do not respond to financial control with calm acceptance. They respond with pride, fury, and retaliation. That's the emotional conflict the insiders describe. Charles hates being manipulated, hates feeling cornered by threats, hates the idea that anyone can force his hand through pressure. And yet he fears the fallout more, because fallout doesn't land on the person who made the threat, it lands on the crown. It lands on the institution. It lands on the future he is trying to protect. So the decision becomes a grim calculation: tolerate a private injustice now, or suffer a public catastrophe later. A trap is set, and it's dressed as mercy. Offer a soft landing in exchange for silence, a carefully structured compromise that sounds generous but functions like a leash: enough comfort to calm the person down, enough restriction to limit their reach. It's the palace's oldest method: don't escalate, contain. Don't fight openly, settle quietly. The arrangement isn't framed as we're buying your silence. It's framed as we're supporting you. And that is how the institution protects itself, by turning control into kindness on paper. But there's always a price to playing that game. Because once the palace starts offering deals to stop threats, it teaches everyone watching that threats work. That's when loyalty becomes transactional, and family becomes a marketplace of leverage. And that's when the most dangerous twist hits. A trusted insider switches sides. Not dramatically, not in a public betrayal quietly. A message forwarded, a detail repeated to the wrong person, a private conversation remembered in public language. The palace doesn't always lose to outsiders. Sometimes it's undone from within, by someone who decides the system no longer deserves protection. And as this crisis tightens, another figure steps closer to the center of the story: William. Because this isn't only Charles' decision, it's William's future. Because any inheritance plan Charles sets today becomes the framework William inherits tomorrow. Insiders say the heir is watching closely, not just as a son, but as the next king, calculating what stability will cost. And if William pushed for changes, it signals something huge. The family isn't just reorganizing money. They're reorganizing power so the next reign starts cleaner, quieter, and harder to threaten. William's stake is simple and ruthless: prevent future blackmail and reduce headline liabilities. He sees the institution like a structure that must survive storms, and he sees certain relatives like cracks that turn storms into collapse. That creates a father-to-son tension that insiders describe as quietly explosive. Charles resists being told what to do, especially by his own heir. William insists on reform, not as a suggestion, but as necessity. And in that tug-of-war sits the question neither of them can escape. Are they protecting people or protecting a system that consumes people? Catherine's influence is hinted at in the background, not as a villain, but as a force pushing for a cleaner future. Protect the children's future. Protect the brand. Protect the next generation from being haunted by the same old dramas. The strategic goal becomes clear: reduce competing centers of privilege so no one else can build a rival power base inside the family. And William, unlike Charles, is rumored to be willing to draw a hard line that his father never drew, because William has watched what hesitation creates. That's where the cliffhanger sharpens. If Charles refuses to go far enough, a rift forms not just political, but deeply personal. A father clinging to loyalty, a son demanding discipline, two visions of monarchy colliding in private while the public sees only calm. And the tragedy is that both believe they are protecting the crown, yet their methods could tear the family apart. But in trying to prevent a scandal, Charles may have ignited something even worse, a legitimacy fight inside his own family. And as the heir tightens the future, a new question emerges: what happens to those who were living off the old system? In the royal family, the loss isn't just money, it's identity. When inheritance shifts, staff disappear, security changes, invitations dry up, and suddenly someone realizes their place was never guaranteed. The palace calls it streamlining. The person affected feels it as exile. Insiders say the fallout has already begun. Subtle cuts, quiet removals, and a new hierarchy forming overnight. And the ones losing out? They won't go quietly. It starts with the soft punishments, the ones the palace prefers because they look like coincidence to the public and feel like suffocation in private. Reduced visibility. Fewer appearances. Less access to the rooms where decisions happen. Privileges that once felt automatic suddenly require approval, and approval suddenly takes time. Protection shifts to security adjusted, staffing trimmed. The invisible shield that once made life smoother quietly thinned until the person affected realizes they are standing in the open. Not publicly attacked, not formally condemned, just subtly unprotected, which is sometimes worse. Inside those walls, the emotional collapse becomes inevitable. The affected relative swings between shame and rage, between humiliation and desperation, because losing inheritance in this world is like losing oxygen. It is not simply a loss of comfort, it is the loss of status, and status is what tells everyone else how to treat you. Doors close, voices change. Allies hesitate. The person begins to understand the cruel truth the palace never says out loud. You were not valued because you were loved. You were valued because you were useful. And when usefulness disappears, affection often follows. Outside, the press narrative begins to split into competing versions of reality. One side calls it reform necessary, overdue, responsible. The other calls it cruelty cold-hearted, humiliating, punitive. Insiders whisper that this isn't accidental. The palace knows how to seed interpretations without making statements. A well-timed friendly briefing here, a carefully worded comment there, and suddenly public opinion starts to tilt. The affected family member watches their story being written without them, and the anger deepens because they know the institution is not simply changing a plan, it is shaping a verdict. That's when the pushback begins. A family member attempts to rally allies, to reverse the decision through pressure, through emotional appeals, through old loyalties they believe they can still collect. Phones start ringing in private. Old contacts are tested. Favors are demanded. There's a scramble to build a counterweight to the new hierarchy forming overnight, because once a hierarchy hardens, it becomes almost impossible to crack. And in that scramble, desperation does what it always does, it makes people reckless. Because what if Charles's adjustment wasn't simply a family cleanup, but a defensive move against something darker? Insiders whisper there's a clause, a buried condition tied to inheritance, that could expose years of quiet deals if it ever becomes public. And now, with plans changing, that clause is at risk of being triggered. The palace isn't just trying to protect money, it's trying to protect legitimacy. And someone is ready to force the truth out. The clause is framed like a bomb with a polite label on it, a condition linking inheritance to behavior, loyalty, or secrecy, something designed to keep people compliant, something built to prevent chaos, something the family accepted in exchange for stability. But clauses like that don't just control people, they create secrets. They create paper trails. They create promises that can be weaponized when someone feels betrayed, and the most dangerous part is that the clause doesn't need to be publicly announced to cause ruin. Its mere existence, once suspected, becomes a threat. Because buried inside it is a hidden promise from years ago, now colliding with the new plan. A promise someone believed was permanent. A promise that may have been made to keep a person quiet, to stop a scandal, to protect the crown at a vulnerable moment. And now, if Charles changes the structure, he risks breaking that promise and breaking it publicly, through consequences that can't be denied. That's where the moral dilemma becomes brutal. Charles must choose between protecting the crown and protecting a person he still loves. Because sometimes the people you love are also the people who can hurt you most. The affected relative senses it too. They signal quietly at first, then more boldly that they will fight publicly if they are cut out. Not a tantrum, not a vague complaint and implied retaliation. A reminder that they know things, a suggestion that they have proof. And the palace reacts the way it always reacts when it smells danger. It tightens. Briefings start. Speculation spikes. The press catches a scent, and once the press catches a scent, the story takes on a life of its own. Suddenly, inheritance isn't just family drama. It looks like a national scandal in the making. And then comes the final dread-soaked twist. Another senior royal may intervene to stop the leak. Not out of kindness, but out of survival. A back-channel call. A private negotiation. A last-minute attempt to buy time. To calm the relative down. To keep the clause buried where it belongs. Because if that clause becomes public, it doesn't just embarrass the family. It raises questions about how power has been managed, how silence has been purchased, and how legitimacy has been protected through private deals. But just when the palace thinks the fallout can be managed, a final twist threatens to turn this into a national-level scandal. And just when the palace thinks it has contained the inheritance storm, the next leak lands, proving this was only the first crack in a much bigger collapse. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.